All right. Hey, so I've got a bit of free time this morning, so I wanted to read some more Gendlin. This paper I found over the weekend, and it seems like it's on the shorter side, so I think I can get through it in the time that I have. And it's about basically, in the title, an introduction to experiencing. And experiencing is, before I get into it, let me just try to articulate what I understand it to mean. Experiencing is basically Genlin's word for like noticing the life process happening in us. Rather than thinking, it's like noticing everything else that's going on in us. It is sort of maybe it's what you do in focusing is experiencing. And he talks about the experiential method elsewhere. I think he said it in one of the other readings that I've done from him, the experiential method. And that means the method in which, or the approach in which, the focus is on experiencing it in terms of noticing and becoming aware of everything that's going on inside you that is not your thought processes. Somebody, I haven't read the Ian McGilchrist book, or maybe I've read a little bit of it, but someone was telling me recently that the whole right brain, left brain thing is kind of a misnomer, because really it should be maybe left brain and everything else. It's not just two sides of the brain, but there's left brain and then there's your whole body, everything else. And so kind of running with that, I think experiencing is like the everything else, being in tune with getting you're putting your attention into and becoming aware of that everything else, and paying attention to the life process going on inside of you. Interoception would fall into that. Noticing your body from the inside. And your felt sense moment by moment to whatever's going on. So that's my understanding of that from here, but I want to read this and get a better understanding. So I will, as usual, I will read the actual text and I will then comment and whatever, talk about it. So this is a descriptive introduction to experiencing by Eugene Gendlin. I believe he wrote this paper, well, it's from the University of Chicago Library. Yeah, okay. So, at any moment, no matter what may be specifically going on in me or outside of me, I find that I can directly refer to a flow of feeling in myself, which I shall term experiencing. Yeah, okay. So a flow of feeling. And this is not necessarily just emotion, from what I understand. Well, I mean, that's what felt sense is, not just emotion, right? It's like that thing that you can't really describe because it's not just sad, happy, pain, anger, etc., right? It's the more subtle, vague, intricate feeling in your whole body. And that's always going on because that is the life process. I know he's not saying that here, but I am feeling that in from other reading that I've done from him. So no matter what's going on, at any moment, you can always turn inward and refer to, notice a flow of feeling in myself. Yeah. Usually, I am also explicitly aware of some of what is going on. I'm thinking thoughts, observing people and things, feeling certain feelings, and so forth. No matter what is specifically going on, I can point in myself to the felt activity or felt process which is involved in my having a feeling, thinking a thought, perceiving a perception, turning to a subject of conversation, etc. So I guess it sort of seems like he's contrasting that with so it's always happening. At any moment we can directly refer to this, but also we are usually explicitly aware of some of it anyway. That's kind of the sense that I'm getting from that. There is explicit awareness to some degree. No matter what is going on, I can point in myself to that felt process involved in the explicit. I guess so. I mean, because he also talks about some people have a really hard time and take a really long time to learn focusing, just in the sense of learning how to notice the felt sense. I've seen videos of him talking about how it takes certain people months of working directly with him before they can actually start noticing the felt sense. So I'm curious what he really means there. No matter what is specifically going on, and maybe it's more specific to him. Maybe this is not general to anybody, but maybe this is about him. No matter what is going on, he can point in himself to the felt process that is involved in my having a feeling. Right, so there's an explicit thing going on, having a feeling, right? Being angry, thinking a thought, thinking about what he wants for lunch, seeing something, noticing something, hearing something, directing his attention, right? Those are all things that he's explicitly aware of, but there's that sort of vague, intricate, felt sensey edge. I'm reminded of what he talked about in the one improvisation provides, when he talks about the relationship between form and I forget the actual term for the concept that he came up with in there, but the life bubbling up from underneath the form around the edges. So there's the explicit thing, which has a form, but then there's all the other stuff that's bubbling up around the edges, and that's your life process, and that's something that you're experiencing, but you don't necessarily have a way to describe yet. I find that whatever is occurring in me, I can always directly point to a felt process which is involved in whatever is occurring in the present moment. I can point to this felt process and ask myself, what kind of experiencing is this? That seems like more or less the focusing question, or that's what focusing is essentially about, right? Noticing the felt process in you in relation to something, right? Or some issue. How does that feel in you? What's the felt sense of this issue? And then asking yourself, well, what is it like? What's it like? What kind of experiencing is it? What's the felt sense? And he, underlines this because it's pointing to this sort of hard to point at sense. The felt process. But it's very specific, The particular felt sense that you have around anything on any particular day is unique. So what is this that I'm feeling right now? Now, I must hurry to explain that this question, what kind of experiencing is this, is my private notation. I don't really mean what kind in any strict logical sense. I'm usually not really after a kind, but asking myself this question focuses my attention on the felt activity, and usually I then find myself referring directly to a felt activity, an as yet unknown, this feeling, an experiencing. I'm using these terms as roughly synonymous since they name something that I do not hear defined adequately. Therefore, when I ask myself, what kind of experiencing is this? I am referring directly to a this, my experiencing, and asking myself, what is this? Okay. Yeah, so he's not talking about... Also, I think maybe this paper's from... Yeah, this is an early paper, 1957. He died in the last 10 years, I believe. So this is from way back. This is from before he published the main focusing book. So some of this stuff is, he's maybe still working it out. But yeah, so he's not trying to categorize the sense. What kind is more like... What kind is just a way for him to focus even more on specifically what the experience is like. It seems maybe, not to say a better question, but another way to ask the question is like, what is it like? And I think that's more similar to what people, Gendlin and others use in the focusing process is what is that felt sense like? And that's what this kind gets at. What kind of experiencing is this? What is it like? But not trying to fit it into categories, because categories are way too abstract and like conceptual, or like categories are a step above this intricate experiencing level that Gendlin's talking about, right? We're not talking about how do I say this? Like, focusing and experiencing, it's all about noticing all of the intricacies, like all of the little weird bits and pieces that if you were trying to categorize something or put something into a theory, you would kind of just ignore the little outlying details, right? It's like mostly it fits into this. You can ignore the little fuzzy shit at the edges, right? But or categories like the form that I was talking about from Improvisation Provides. It's the form. But focusing and the experiencing is about noticing not the form, but the shit that's coming up from underneath. So it's explicitly not about the thing that is definable, articulable, comparable, static even, right? It's about the thing that's coming up from underneath around the edges of the category. Okay. I find that there is always an implicit answer to my question in the felt experiencing to which I refer. I never find a blank. I always find some this, which feels to me as if I could say something about what it is. Usually, I arrive at some formulation which interests me or which is pertinent to whatever reason I have had for asking about it. So an implicit answer, right? He hasn't really talked about that word here at all, but he has used explicit awareness, right? So implicit is not... I feel like I should look up the definition of that word better, but let's loosely call it the opposite of explicit, right? Where explicit is fully formulated, it's fully articulable, it's explicit, it's obvious, it's like right there in front of you, you can't miss it. Implicit is sort of hiding, still fuzzy, still inarticulable. So I find that there's always an implicit answer to my question. Right, so he's asking himself, what is this? And there is some kind of answer, always. So that's interesting, right? Because he's asking, what is this? So he's starting with a this already in himself. He knows this is something. What is this? And then he's asking that, right? What is this? And then there's a further this. He never draws a blank. I always find some this. Which feels to me as if I could say something about what it is, right? So it's like there's something more. He already has an awareness of something, and he's asking about it. What is it? What kind of experiencing is this? And then there's more implicit that arrives in answer to that question. It's still implicit. It's still not, fully spelled out. He doesn't necessarily have words for it. But, so that's interesting for him to say formulation here. Usually I arrive at some formulation, which interests me. Form, It feels, I don't know, maybe he's saying something different than what I would expect him to say. Or maybe he's using this word a little more loosely to say, like, I don't know, I'm not sure if he means that the formulation is sort of synonymous with this implicit answer, or if it's a further step. It could be either one, I guess. Okay. On the other hand, I find that what I say about it is usually very insufficient. Of course, sometimes I cannot say about this experiencing just what it is, but even when I can, I am struck by the fact that there would be an endless amount to be said about it. What I do say about it seems to depend on my purpose for asking. If I know just why I'm asking, I can often get a conceptualization that seems to be the right one. But if I don't know why I'm asking, say I do it just for an experiment, then there seems to be an endless amount of possible conceptualizations of it. From nearly every possible angle, I could find something to say in it. Whatever moment of experiencing I have differentiated, even a very specific aspect or quality of the experiencing, if I differentiate that, seems to be infinitely rich in implicit meaning. Okay, I feel like I'm gonna fill in some stuff that I understand from other readings, specifically from a process model. I've talked about it in other videos I've made, but he has this thing called everything by everything, EVEV. It's a way of talking about how every next step of the life process, for example, is a product of everything that has come before, right? And everything that comes next is a product of everything that comes before, everything by everything. And that, the everything that leads to the next everything, this is gonna get all crazy sounding, right? But like all of our experience behind us, for example, it's not necessarily differentiated, right? It's literally everything. You could go back and write, like if you're writing a history of yourself, there's an infinite way in which you could write that history. There's an infinite number of experiences and threads that you could pull out from your history because it is everything, right? You could focus on all sorts of things and you would never exhaust that. And so, yeah, it's like, okay, imagine if you were writing a history of yourself, right? And you're just like, okay, well, I want to write about my past or something. Like if it was just as open of a prompt as that, there's a million infinite ways that you could do that, right? But if you ask a particular question, if you're like, I want to write a history of my experience as a person coming from where I was born, like how did I get from where I was born to where I am now, right? That would give you a much more defined, right? It's like a why. You know why you're asking, and so you can have more clear conceptualizations of it, right? You're not necessarily going to think about and refer to everything. So that's kind of it. And so he has this other concept called crossing, which is like the different strands of, maybe this is irrelevant for right now, but the different strands from your past, right? Like say your experience as your gender or whatever, and then your experience of growing up where you grew up, right? And you focus on just those two strands of your experience, and those two things cross. And you can think more about each of those things in reference to each other, right? You can get really specific. You can be like, how did my experience as a man, or whatever, in my case, how did my experience as a man influence and be influenced by my experience growing up where I grew up, and vice versa? How did my experience of growing up where I grew up influence my experience of being a man? Right, and you can narrow down the way in which you think about and conceptualize your history by knowing why you're asking, right? Having a clear question. But if you don't have that clear question, you can just do it an infinite number of ways. Right? I am struck by the fact that there would be an endless amount to be said about it. Ask about my life, and it's like, well, I could literally talk about that forever. What is it that you want to know? So anyway, yeah, that's how I understand that. And this last bit, what whatever moment of experiencing I have differentiated, even a very seems to be infinitely rich in implicit meaning. So kind of sounds like he's getting at that, like even if he pulls something out, even if he pulls some, like sort of explicitly, right, if he's pointing at something in particular about his experience, even that he can talk about forever, right? Because again, we're talking about implicit intricacy, not the stuff that's categorizable, but the fuzzy stuff around the edges, right? It's like you're taking a microscope, or like first a magnifying glass, right? And like taking a magnifying glass to your own body, for example, like your own hand, right? First you look at your hand without the magnifying glass, and then you look at it. It's like, oh wow, there's so much more there in that same spot that I was looking. It's so much more intricate than I realized now that I can see it closer and I'm focusing more on it. And then you get a freaking microscope and you look at the exact same spot, and again, there's so much more there, right? And you're looking at the same spot as before, and you can keep going and going and going, right? And so that's, I think, kind of what he's getting at, is you focus on one little thing, right? Your hand or your fingernail or whatever, but you can like continuously look closer and closer and closer at that, and it's going to be infinitely rich with, in this case, what he's talking about is implicit meaning. So we can do that with our experience. We can do that with our felt sense in the way I described about, zooming in on your hand or whatever, your fingernail. You can do that with your felt sense. Now, this is just what you would expect if this, to which I point, is a slice of experience. However, there are two aspects of this experiencing which do not conform to the usual definition of experience. Okay, I mean, that's pretty straightforward. I just need to keep reading. But I like this word that he uses here, right? It's a slice. Like if you are writing a history about yourself or anything, you're taking a slice of history, but you're never going to encompass everything, right? Because like I said about the magnifying glass on your hand, like you can never, there's always more to see in any little part that you want to look at. There's always more to see. So it's always only ever going to be a slice of everything. Okay, so two aspects of this experiencing which do not conform to the usual definition of experience. 1. Experiencing is something of which I am aware in a felt, implicitly meaningful way. Okay, it's something of which I am aware in a felt, implicitly meaningful way. So felt as in somatically, right? Feeling it in my body and not thinking it, not conceptualizing it. Implicit in the sense of it's not fully articulate, right? It's not obvious. It's not fully fleshed out. Meaningful, that's a big word with Gendlin. It's hard for me to say exactly what that means. His first book, I believe it's his first book, is just called Experiencing and the Creation of Meaning, and it's a philosophical work about what is meaning, and how do we derive meaning from our own experience. So I'm not going to mess around too much and try to explain this. So I'll leave a sort of black box around that word for now, but yeah. Experiencing is something of which I am aware in a felt, implicitly meaningful way. I guess a question that I have in general is like, what is not meaningful? How would he describe something that is not meaningful? I don't know. Okay, 2. Any, no matter how finely differentiated, little aspect of experiencing is just as endlessly rich in possible conceptualizations. Any little aspect of experiencing is just as endlessly rich in possible conceptualizations. Just as rich as any other, I guess. Right? Like I was saying with the zooming in on your hand idea. Like, you could do that infinitely. I mean, theoretically, I guess. Maybe, whatever, you get like fucking atoms. But I don't know science well enough. But yeah, you zoom in on, I'll just say that with my naive understanding of science. But yeah, you could zoom in on that infinitely, endlessly, and it's endlessly rich. You'll discover more and more and more. Okay, so let me discuss these in turn. So, 1. Implicitly meaningful felt awareness. Rogerian, as in Carl Rogers, Rogerian and other theories speak of experience as aware or unaware content. I find, however, that this experiencing is really neither aware content, since I don't have a conceptualization of it or know what it is, nor is it unaware content, since I am aware of it in a felt, implicit way. Thus, experiencing is neither quite aware nor quite unaware. Furthermore, it is not content. At least it seems to be capable of being a source of endless amounts of content. I can conceptualize it endlessly, accurately or inaccurately, to be sure, but endlessly. Thus, experiencing appears to me to be something quite different from the contents of the conceptualizations I form of it. Experiencing appears capable of supporting very many conceptualizations, of giving birth to endless content, yet it is still there afterward, ready to be conceptualized even further. No matter how much and variously I conceptualize it, it is still there as something else, something felt, something I can point to quite apart from the accurate conceptualization. Yeah, okay. Where to begin fleshing this out? So it's neither unaware nor aware. Aware seems fairly synonymous here with explicit, right? Because it doesn't have a conceptualization and you don't know what it is. You can't say what it is, but you are aware of it, right? You're experiencing it, you're aware of it enough to be like, what is this? So it's not out of your awareness. It's not just purely whatever, subconscious, unconscious. Neither aware nor unaware, neither fully explicit nor fully just not even, what's implicit's not the right word here. Explicit, implicit, and I don't know, out of sight, out of mind, whatever. You're not even noticing it. It's neither of those things. Furthermore, it is not content in the sense that it's like not right. It is not the conceptualizations I form of it, right? If I say, what kind of experiencing is this? And I do find myself grasping it, being able to articulate it, it is more than that. There's more richness to it, right? I can go in further and discover more intricacy to it. It's not like I've captured the entire thing with my conceptualization of the felt sense, right? So it's more than what the conceptualizations can capture. So it's not quite just the content, right? It's not the articulable content. I've talked about this, I think, elsewhere, either on videos or on Twitter, but you know how that's a big difference between Gendlin and a lot of other thinkers in psychology, is that Gendlin does not see a human as being sort of like a bag of content, and the project to just be discovering what the content inside is, right? You're like, oh, well, I figured out everything that's inside of me, and now, so I'm just a big bag of these psychological things, you know, syndromes, all whatever, tendencies, personalities. I'm just a big bag of stuff, big bag of psychological stuff. He doesn't see it that way. All right, the things that you can conceptualize, the things that you could call content, are still endlessly rich, and they're ready to be conceptualized even further. No matter how much and variously I conceptualize it, it is still there as something else, something felt, something I can point to quite apart from the accurate conceptualization, right? The conceptualization is something that we do intellectually, verbally, but the thing that we're verbalizing about is felt, experiencing. So it's not, you know, the conceptualization itself isn't the thing. It helps us talk about the thing, but it isn't the thing, right? It's like map versus territory kind of thing. I feel like I skimmed through this before, and I think he might talk about map versus territory, and if not in this one, he does talk about it in another paper. But yeah, it's right. The map is never the territory, because the territory is the entire fucking landscape, you know, the entire ecosystem. It's more than a map can ever capture, right? Because you can also always zoom in closer, like what I talked about with zooming in on your hand. You can do that with any part of the territory. Just pick one fucking tree, right? Pick a leaf on one tree, and you can zoom in forever. I'm not going to read this footnote because I forget where it's pointing to. I guess it's here. If I can discover errors in my conceptualizations as I check them back against the implicit... yeah. Right, so that's that. That's what focusing is about, right? That's kind of what the role of the focusing partner is too. It's like, oh, so it's this? And then you're like, is it this? Does it match my felt sense? Yes or no? And no, in this way, there's this other thing that's not captured by that conceptualization of it, right? So you check back against your felt sense of whether the explication of it is accurate. Okay, so I just want to make sure that I don't go so slowly with this that I can't get through it. I've got time. Okay. This observation leads me to define the term implicit or implicitly meaningful and its opposite, explicit. I would like to define implicit and explicit as naming just this observation, namely, the relationship between an aspect of experiencing and the countless conceptualizations to which it can give birth. So define implicit and explicit as naming just this observation, namely, the relationship between an aspect of experiencing and the countless conceptualizations to which it can give birth. I shall call these countless meanings implicit. When they are conceptualized, I shall call them explicit. I will not imply that before conceptualization, they were all the time in the experiencing already. By implicit, I do not mean that explicit meanings are there but hidden. I mean that they are implicit. That is, that they can be conceptualized, but the experiencing which is implicitly meaningful is in itself something else. To bring this home, let us say I have conceptualized my this experiencing in a certain accurate way. Now a meaning has become explicit. However, I can still refer directly to this felt experiencing in which this meaning is even now still implicit. Experiencing that which is implicitly meaningful remains different in nature from explicit meanings even after some meanings have been explicitly conceptualized. So this is sort of what I was talking about with the writing a history, right? Like the everything by everything. So everything that comes before until now, right? Everything in the past. It's literally everything. You can go in and you can pick out strands, you can pick out stories, you can pick out events and talk about events and how events came to be, right? But you're doing that in retrospect. You're explicating stuff from the past, from where you stand now. It doesn't mean that all that stuff was explicit before. Right? So that's like a core thing. I guess, yeah, he wouldn't have really clarified this until much later, but in a process model, he talks about, well, the whole point of a process model is to say an alternate conceptualization of reality, which is one in which reality isn't built like with units, with static units, right? That are essentially individual from each other, right? Like atoms, fucking cells, rocks, trees, individual human beings, right? That's our normal way of thinking about reality, is that like everything is unitary, atomic, right? Atomic, not actually referring to atoms, but just in the sense of being separate and individual, and that things are then built by putting those things together. But a process model is saying like there's a way of conceiving of how reality works where things are not divided to begin with, and the division happens sort of analytically in retrospect as needed, right? With our own minds. And things are connected and moving in process. Everything's in process, fundamentally. And if something is static, then that means actually that the process, the life process, is something stuck. Why am I bringing that up? Wow. I guess it's like, yeah, if you're writing history and you're zooming in on, some event from history or telling a particular story, it's like history is literally everything that has happened, right? Stories don't already exist explicitly carved out as things, right? We make them, basically. We draw those lines. We draw those narrative lines. We cut those boundaries and say, like, this is part of the story and that's not part of the story, right? Or like we go in and we talk about events and we say, like, well, this was a cause and this was a consequence of this event and this wasn't, right? This person played a huge role, right? There are so many histories written about the exact same event in history, and they're all different, right? Because there's an infinite amount of ways to go back and explicate and conceptualize something from the past, because it's not built out of already defined building blocks, right? That's what we do when we go back and we conceptualize. So I'm saying that because he says, right, I will not imply that before conceptualization, they were all the time in the experiencing already. By implicit, I do not mean that explicit meanings are there but hidden. They can be conceptualized, but the experiencing, which is implicitly meaningful, is itself something else, right? So the history, what actually happened, is not the conceptualization that we create of it, right? What actually happened fucking happened, and it's way in the past. Our storytelling about it is not it. The stories can be made from where we stand now, looking back, but they're not already there, right? We have to draw out and explicate things. But that's like a creative endeavor. And what we arrive at could have been done differently, depending on, again, like why we're looking at history, right? And how that leads us to see what happened. But it can be done infinitely. I think that's enough. Okay. 2. No matter how finely differentiated, it is endlessly rich. As we noted, it would not seem surprising that a moment of experience contains so many possible contents of conceptualization, so many implicit meanings. However, even if I do not take a whole moment, even if I very finely distinguish this experiencing, still I find myself referring to something capable of very many conceptualizations. Yeah, okay. I've said enough about that. From the construct experience, as usually defined, it would follow that there are a great many contents in any moment, but any one such content is just itself. Why can I differentiate one single aspect of my present experiencing as I feel it implicitly, and then still find endless possible conceptualizations implicit in it? Yeah, so how does that work? How does it work that I can conceptualize it? I can differentiate one aspect of my felt sense of my experience and then find... Well, differentiate doesn't necessarily mean conceptualize it, right? But it's about being like, well, there's something there, something I can point to. They don't have words for it beyond that. I wonder if Gendlin still doesn't even have his whole ... thing yet, because he hasn't used it at all in this paper. Right, that ... is like a stand-in for the something, the felt sense. So you can differentiate in as much as you can point to it and call it a something without necessarily having conceptualized it. But then that thing that you're pointing to can still find endless possible conceptualizations. Yeah, how does that work? Perhaps if experience were conceived of as a process, this question could be answered. Any content, no matter how well differentiated, involves a moment of the total process then going on. This total process isn't simply other contents. It is the ongoing organismic activity of the moment. These organismic processes can be viewed as chemical, physical, visceral, etc. Any explicit content, any concept or percept, can occur only as supported by a living organism, that is, by physiological and visceral processes, right? So now he's bringing in that, the body, the life aspect of this. Any content involves a moment of the total process then going on, right? So content, I think I can say form, right? Like a static form is sort of synonymous with content, right? A piece of content about what's going on is a moment, like a freeze frame of the total process. And the total process isn't simply the static snapshots of the other parts of the process. It is the ongoing organismic activity of the moment, right? Like we humans, for example, our body, our heart, for example, must be pumping in order for us to live. There are deep physiological processes which must be going on in order for us to be living, right? You could dissect us as a cadaver and really be like, oh, well, there's this part and there's this part and there's this part, and take snapshots of everything, but that thing is no longer in process. You can break it apart into all its different parts, but it's no longer a thing, right? I worked as a butcher for a little while, and the cuts of meat, for example, are not standard across the world. There are different ways to butcher a cow, and you can end up with different kinds of cuts, with different kinds of steaks. Even you can butcher a single muscle from a cow in different ways and end up with different cuts of meat, right? But you're butchering a cow, it's not alive anymore, right? The whole thing, an alive cow, is a living organismic process, And when you cut it up into different pieces, which you can do an infinite number of ways, which is my point about the butchering, you can do that, but it's not alive anymore. Once you dissect it, it's not alive. Right? Like, a ribeye steak is not a part of an alive cow. It's a content. It's a piece of content from a cow, but it isn't part of an alive cow, and an alive cow doesn't have a ribeye steak in it. That's something that we cut out of it. Right? So these processes must be going on for life. And if you freeze frame them, the freeze frame isn't life. The content isn't life. Okay. I have made 2 points. 1, an individual can always point to an awareness of an implicitly meaningful flow of feeling, which I have termed experiencing. And 2, no matter how finely differentiated aspect of this present flow of no matter how finely differentiated aspect of this present flow of feeling which the individual might point to. This sentence is fucking me up. No matter how finely differentiated aspect of this present flow of feeling which the individual might point to is capable of countless possible conceptualizations. Yeah, I feel like maybe there's just a comma missing. Any aspect of this flow of feeling we can point to is capable of countless possible conceptualizations. Yeah. I would like to propose A, that the construct experience be considered not only as bunches of contents, but also as ongoing organismic processes, and B, that a term experiencing be employed to refer not to the theoretical construct experience, but rather to the directly given felt datum of implicitly meaningful feeling. Wow, this is cool. I feel like I'm reading his development of a process model. Yeah, so experience is not just a bunch of contents, right? Like all of the cuts of meat that we get from a cow is a bunch of content from a cow, but the cow's not experiencing that anymore. Experiencing as a verb is to be employed to refer not to the construct experiencing, but rather to the directly given felt datum, right? Which is what he started with, right? You can always feel, I can always directly refer to a flow of feeling in myself, which I call experiencing. And that's what we do in focusing. We refer to that constant flow of directly given felt datum of implicitly meaningful feeling. That's what we're doing when we tune in to the felt sense. We're tuning in to the data of our experience process. Okay. Application in therapy. What I have said can be employed to describe what happens in therapy. As a counselor, I am very aware of the client's direct reference to his present experiencing. I try not to consider the client's words as simply cognitive meanings, but as arising from a present experiencing. I view his expression as an expression of the experiencing itself, as he is directly referring to it. For example, the client comes in and sits down and says, "Now, what shall I talk about? Let me see." Most often, this expression indicates not merely that he wonders what to talk about, but also that he is in that moment turning his inner attention to his momentary present experiencing and referring directly to it. When he next says, "I'm tired," I know that this isn't irrelevant, nor is it cognitively relevant. It is simply the first conceptualization of the present experiencing to which he has just given his attention. Next, he might say, "I don't know what I'm doing," which of course may be relevant to some problem, but more often it is again a very rough conceptualization of this experiencing, and so on. Yeah. Okay. I feel like that was pretty straightforward. Try not to consider the client's words as simply cognitive meanings, but as arising from a present experiencing, right? They're like our best attempt to report. This doesn't sound quite right, but I'm going to run with it for now. It's like our attempt to narrate and report and express what's going on in us moment by moment. Is us being the client, I guess, in that example, right? He says, "Okay, well, what should I talk about? Let me see," right? That's what's going on in him at the moment, or us. It's like, I don't know, I don't really know, like, I'm wondering, right? There's a question in there, like, and a question is a sort of orientation towards yourself and information. It's like, I want to know something. So let me look, let me see, right? So that's what's going on in the person. That's what his attention is doing, right? He's turning his inner attention to his experiencing and referring directly to it. And then he says, "I'm tired." And it's like, okay, so that's something. I'm curious what he means that this isn't irrelevant, nor is it cognitively relevant. It is not cognitively relevant. Yeah, I don't quite know what he means by that. Maybe it's like, it's not like that's the thing that he necessarily wants to talk about. It's just, yeah, that's like him commenting on, reporting on what he's noticing about his experience right now. Anyway, yeah, I think that's straightforward. Later in the hour, when the client is probably working with some very specifically differentiated this, instead of the whole glob he finds as he starts, the client still refers more or less constantly to his present this experiencing. As he tries to conceptualize something exactly, I remain concerned about his direct reference to his felt, implicitly meaningful feeling process. The several things he may say about such a this are often cognitively unrelated, yet they are very much related in the sense that they take their rise as conceptualizations of this feeling, or this moment, or aspect of present experiencing. In my responses, I also try to refer to his present experiencing. So maybe what he was talking about with cognitively relevant is like, are they logically connected, or is it like logically meaningful, right? So, right, because he says the several things he may say about it this, right? So it's like, okay, I have a felt sense, and I say this about it, I say this about it, but those things are not necessarily referring to each other, and they might even be somewhat contradictory, right? I feel this and I feel this, but like those things don't match, right? It's like, I've certainly had that experience. They're not logically derivative of each other, for example. One doesn't lead to the other. So, yeah, Gendlin's saying he still refers more or less constantly to this experiencing, right? Because he talked earlier in that footnote about checking back against the experiencing, against that felt sense, to see if the conceptualization is accurate, right? So that's how you know you're still referring to your experiencing and not just going off on some train of thought. And Gendlin, as the therapist, remains concerned about the consistent direct reference to that experiencing, because that's what keeps you tied down to, or like grounded. Grounded, I feel like, works really well here, right? Because grounded is like our body. Our bodies are effectively our experience of the ground. We're tied to the ground. It's material. It's our, to be grounded in our bodies is to be in ourselves and referencing our material reality, in a sense. That's kind of weird, and I know that there's like weird philosophical implications of talking about material, but yeah, like to be in your body, to be connected to the physical life process rather than abstracted from it. Okay, conclusions. Experiencing is a present felt activity, or more simply, a felt this. Activity. It's not a noun, or it's not a thing. It's not an object. It's a verb. Because the this, again, is not a snapshot. It's not a content, right? Because at no point do you ever do that. Like, as you notice, you are also living. You are living. You're in the living process. So as you notice this in you, at no moment are you ever just fully freezing the moment and taking a snapshot. Because you are not. You are still living. In the case of any explicit content, one may directly refer to experiencing as involved in having that content, and thus point to some differentiated aspect of experiencing. One may call this experiencing this. Somehow that paragraph did not sink in. In the case of any explicit content, one may refer to experiencing it as involved in having that content. Right, so the experience of, it's not the content, but the having of the content, right? So we've conceptualized it, we've made it explicit, and now we have that. We have the idea, we have the words for it, we have the image of it. And we can point very specifically then to this aspect of our experience. But the experiencing is the having of that explicit thing. It's not the explicit thing, it's the having of it. Any this experiencing can be conceptualized in a great many ways, yet this experiencing will remain, perhaps change slightly, as an implicitly meaningful felt this. Yeah. So this can be conceptualized infinitely, yet the thing that we're trying to conceptualize is not any of those conceptualizations, and it remains implicit and remains as felt, with the allowance that it can change. Experiencing can be differentiated. Aspects of experiencing can be pointed to as a this and thus differentiated in a great many ways. The apparently endless possibilities for conceptualization do not seem to be reduced by such differentiation. No matter how finely differentiated, countless conceptualizations appear possible. Yeah. So no matter, right? So it's like, I'm like, okay, I want to look at my hand. So I've differentiated it from the rest of my body. I've differentiated it from my arm and my wrist, my hand, right? But now let me look closer at my hand. Let me look at my hand with a magnifying glass. Let me look at my hand with a microscope, right? It can be endlessly conceptualized, differentiated. More can be seen, explicated about that thing, no matter how finely we go in. Experiencing differs from experience as usually defined in that, 1, it is neither strictly aware nor unaware. It is felt and implicitly meaningful. And 2, it is not cognitive contents. Rather, it is implicitly meaningful. The term implicit refers to the many possible conceptualizations of the experiencing which can be made without thereby eliminating the experiencing itself. Hence, experiencing is itself something different in nature from the contents of conceptualizations. Yeah, I feel like I'm still left hanging with the what meaningful means for Gendlin. And that's fine, because I will continue to read this stuff and understand it better. But it's just such a common word that you almost can't escape, right? It's almost like I have to use it in even asking a question. It's like, what does meaningful mean? What is the meaning of meaning for Gendlin? So it's a tricky concept. But like I said, his very first book, I believe, it's his very first book anyway, is about experiencing and the creation of meaning, right? So it's about how everything that he's been talking about in this article, experiencing, is involved in the creation of meaning. So what is meaning? I still don't quite know, but we'll get there. And so that's it. That's the end of reading this paper. That's the end of reading a descriptive introduction to experiencing. I had fun. I hope you had fun if you've listened to this whole thing. And until next time, have a great day. Cheers.